Well, good morning, everybody. Okay, so you've probably all heard of spanakopita. If you've ever been to any Greek restaurant, they're going to have spanakopita, and that's a mixture of spinach, feta cheese, and egg, and all wrapped up in phyllo dough. Okay, but its cousin, probably its ancestor, is hortopita. Uh, Hortopita is wild greens. And so instead of just spinach, it's a mixture of any kind of greens, spring greens. I'll tell you, I happen to belong to a CSA, Community Sustainable Agriculture, where I pay like a subscription to a farm. And so in the spring, I am overwhelmed with greens. Plus, I'm kind of a backyard herb grower. So I've got all kinds of herbs in my garden, which I incorporate in here. And I'll tell you, I got into making this several years ago when I was inundated with mustard greens. Okay. I confess I have never voluntarily gone out and purchased mustard greens in a market, right? And I cooked my mustard greens once following standard recipes and went, okay, I find it hard to believe people actually eat these. And so I found this recipe and realized with enough onions and feta cheese, you can disguise the taste of anything and it will still taste good. And so let me tell you a little bit, and I don't know, you can follow along with the recipe. The critical element is there is no single recipe for hortopita. That everybody's going to do it different. There are vegan versions where you just don't put in the feta and the egg. I don't ever put in the egg. Okay. And if you don't put in the feta, I would suggest you just put in a little lemon juice and you've got greens pie. So rather than have you sit here and watch me chop and chop and chop, I did my pre-chop. And I'll tell you, most of the times I make this, and I do make it pretty much every spring or often even in the winter, I'll have greens and there's inevitably a Super Bowl potluck or something else, a potluck that I take it to. And people are just amazed, right? Because this is always really good. And I use whatever greens I have. So today I've got a mixture of, I have put in mustard greens because I have had mustard greens, kale. I always put in just kind of to moderate it a little bit. The one package of spinach, and I usually just use frozen spinach, leaf spinach, not the finely chopped. The rule of thumb is the coarser the green, the finer it gets chopped. And something like spinach could be in pretty big. I use like frozen leaf spinach, and maybe I'll just run a knife through it a little bit. So what I recommend, which is the procedure is slightly different from how I wrote it, because I kind of wrote it and then I was making mine and went, oh, wait a minute. That's right. I don't really like wash them and chop them all in advance. What I do is I chop my onions and I start my pan and I put it on kind of a low saute. And while the onions are cooking, I chop the next coarsest vegetable. So in that case, it was my mustard greens, and I do take out the center rib and really you're just working on the leaves. And that goes in, and and then the kale goes in, and I just kind of keep adding to it because the whole point is I want to cook it until everything is sort of just wilted. And if you think about it, I've got about 12 ounces, maybe even as much of a pound. I actually did take my kitchen scale and kind of weigh it to see how much greens I was putting in it. And I was right at like 12 ounces coming in. So all those vegetables are going to go in there. Then herbs, you can use whatever you've got. I'm calling, quote, fennel an herb for this purposes. If I happen to have had a bulb of fennel, I would have chopped up some of that bulb. Sometimes I don't have any fennel. I've got a little celery and I sneak in a little celery. Sometimes I sneak in a little cabbage. Okay, so you're kind of generally getting the gist here, right? That basically you put whatever greens you've got into this. And if you're buying them, if you can't stand mustard greens, well, maybe you want to use chard. Chard is really excellent in this dish. So I would have taken like a large skillet, sauteed these, and just kept adding things until I got my herbs in and got it all so it was all kind of wilted and slightly soft. I want it as dry as possible. So I've taken something like my frozen spinach and I just defrost it, put it in a colander, press on it, and get like every bit of water out of it that I could possibly get out of it. And all of my fresh greens and herbs, I've run through a salad spinner to get as dry as possible. Because like I said, I want them wilted, but I don't want this to be soggy. I'll tell you, just within the last year, twice I have been in Greek restaurants, ordered spanakopita, and been really disappointed because it was like super soggy. And there's two things that make it soggy. And one is if you've got too much water in your greens to begin with. And the second is I want my greens cool before I start my final assembly. If they're still like hot and steamy, it will tend to make the dough more like soggy. Okay, so that's the general story of the greens. I happen to put in parsley, fresh dill, fresh oregano, and fresh mint because I had all of those growing right now in my garden. If I didn't have any of those, I would probably still need to go get some parsley. But the dill you could use dried. If you don't have any mint, you can use mint tea bags and just open up the contents of the tea bags, and that'll give you like dried mint leaves because most people don't have dried mint leaves in their like spice cabinet. And you can use dried dill, and then there's other esoteric herbs which you could put into, and it sort of depends how like bitter you want it. I don't put in marjoram because my marjoram that's growing in my yard has a very soap-like flavor, which I don't exactly understand because it's basically plain marjoram. But I think dried it tastes fine, but fresh it really tastes kind of weird. So anyway, so I've done all of those. I let it cool down. I crumple in my feta cheese. If I'm going to add the egg, I would beat the egg, crumple the feta cheese into the egg, mix it all together, and then I let the whole thing cool. I usually do it the day before, and so I got a lot of greens. Phyllo dough. Sold in the freezer section of major supermarkets, sold at your Mideast and Mediterranean groceries. I tell you, I have no brand loyalty. So there's no particular one that I would recommend above any other. I will warn you, if you buy it at like a Mediterranean market, they may have multiple brands in multiple thicknesses. And so you just want to be careful that you get the thickness you intend. If you're making baklava, you want the one that's as thin as possible. For this, you can buy the thin one or you could buy thicker ones. It doesn't matter. But that is kind of a concern. So our phyllo, I have had mine in my deep freezer for like at least a year. It'll last almost indefinitely if it's kept cold. You want to thaw it in the refrigerator for a few days and then let it warm up a little bit, which is why I've got it out of the package because I had it sitting here on my countertop so it would warm to room temperature. A few tricks. I do have, it's a cool day. I'm not going to need this. If it was like a really hot, dry day, I would have my towel handy and dampened. And sometimes people say put as I open it up, I would keep it like covered with either a sheet of wax paper or plastic wrap and my towel on top. We're not going to be making something with like 25 layers. We're really only making something with 6 and 6 layers. So I'm not going to be protecting it as much, but if it is like the weather's really dry, you'd want to protect it because otherwise it'll dry out. By the way, if you ever want to make this dough yourself, which I do not recommend, it is horrendous amount of work. I have never done it, but I have read about it. And basically, you mix up your flour and water, and then it turns out my family is of Armenian extraction, and the Armenian version has a little bit of yogurt mixed in, but sometimes it's basically just water and flour, and you use cornstarch to roll it out. And for all practical purposes, you take a chunk of dough about the size of an egg and you try to cover the top of a card table by rolling it out with a long rolling pin that's about the length of a broom handle. So, like I said, it's not something for the faint of heart. So I'm gonna just unwrap mine. And I've got lots of layers here and lots of sheets. I'll pick one up. This is almost like dealing with very thin fabric. And if you notice, there's a crack in it, but I'm not going to worry about that because when I start assembling, I'm going to like basically put it back together and just press on it a little. If I got several sheets that when they have, when I open the package and I've got several that have got cracks, I'm going to try to incorporate those in the middle of whatever I'm making. So I have a nice pristine sheet for my top. And then my next critical element is olive oil. I find it easier to just like put it in something. I'm not going to bother to measure. I'm just going to pour some out. If I need more, I'll put more in. And I have a really nice pastry brush. And so I use my pastry brush. If you've got one of a really good like olive oil mister that'll give you a nice uniform spray, you could use that. I don't ever use the like aerosolized stuff, but it would probably work. Okay. I'm just more concerned that it's got other strange additives in it. So I'm going to take my brush, and first I'm just going to paint a thin layer on the bottom of my pan. I'm going to take my pan and get a feel for how that works relative to the size of my sheets. And so a half a sheet is just about right for my pan. I usually use scissors. So I'm just cutting my dough so it'll fit in my pan. I'm a little extra with my overlap, but I'm not going to worry about it. So because I'm just going to fold that in and it's going to become a layer. I'll take my pastry brush, paint the layer, And then what I do is I like rotate a quarter of a turn for every layer when I'm painting, just because when I initially put down the brush, it's usually got a little more oil on it. And this way I can sort of work fast and not worry about it. Take my next sheet, lay it down. I am painting between every single layer. I'm not leaving a double layer here. The oil's going to add flavor. It's also what's going to give us that fluffiness, and for the top layers, that crispness. It's kind of like making Danish pastry, but you're not, or croissants, but you're not incorporating the fat in early. We're kind of adding it after the fact. So I'm going to take my next single layer.
And Sue, quick question. Obviously, you have more experience doing this, but someone who might make it for the first time, how long do you think it would take them to get the hang out of peeling, cutting the strips, the pastries?
It's very much like working with tissue paper. So it's not that difficult. It's just like I said, when I first saw it, and I was like, pretty young. I'm going to say, I was like a child. I saw it and I was like, I'd had the pastries and I was like, that's what that stuff is. It never occurred to me that it was actually made with individual layers. Yeah, no, like I said, it's very, very difficult to make this dough. This is, but to handle the dough, and like I said, I've seen it in almost every market now. Just imagine that you're working with paper, and you can cut it with a knife. I just, like I said, I find it easier for this purposes to use scissors. So I'm just kind of going along. Yeah, I was almost going to suggest that you like unmute and see if people had other questions, but and I know I have watched Marguerite's food demos, and she's often done things with the dough, and she usually sprays. Okay, and so that that does work. This is one of the few things I make that isn't layered with melted butter or ghee, and so if I'm using clarified butter, then obviously for it's like making sweet pastries, I'd want to use real butter. I'm just, and like I said, part of why it is sort of like tissue paper, or seems like tissue paper to me, is why I use the scissors. And like I said, I'm kind of arranging it so that each layer, my extra is being equally distributed around the pan. And I'll just keep painting. I got too many more layers to go here. And I want to put in, for something like this, 4 to 6 layers. I have read, but I'm not necessarily familiar enough to say I agree or disagree, that if you kind of crumple the bottom layers a little bit, it's less likely to get soggy on the bottom. But like I said, I don't know that that's really true or not. I just know that it's kind of disappointing when it is soggy on the bottom. Okay, so this one I'm going to save my half for the next one. Then I'm just going to pick all my greens. I don't know that you can see this that well. Once you get an idea of the texture, you can't really see it that well. But I chop them by hand. I bet you could use a food processor, but you don't want to like make, puree. You want them still pretty fluffy. But like I said, if it's a coarse green, chopped up finer, as they get softer, chop them less. I have to admit, when I was doing this, it was really tempting when I got to the herbs and I'm chopping away to like pull out my food processor. And I just decided, nah, I don't want to bother to clean it. So I'm just going to go with that. And then I'm just going to spread this around. So I cover my pan. You could probably do this using entirely frozen greens if that's what you had. But because there's, same thing. You go to the frozen food section of the market and they got chard, they got frozen mustard greens. You could buy those chopped ones and then you would just thin it down a little. Okay, I'm going to put that one in there. And then I'm going to start building layers from this side. And so same thing, I'm layering and painting with my olive oil. And here's an example where I had taken off the extra from one and I'm just adding it to the extra from this one to make another full layer here. And I'll just keep rotating my pan so that I keep my oil pretty uniform. I want to get the whole sheet, but I also, I'm not going to spend like 10 minutes trying to be perfect getting the oil distributed all over the sheet. When we get done, we'll see that we've got quite, even unless I were making a full size pan, and I mean like a full sheet pan, which is usually about what the size of this dough is set for. I'm usually going to have dough left over, and at the end I'll give you some hints of what you could do with your leftover dough. It will keep in your refrigerator for at least a couple of weeks. Sometimes I've lost track of it, but it like I said, it'll hold if you seal it up real good. I have heard that you can refreeze it, but I never do that. Okay. I can't really explain why I don't, but that's just not something that I ever do. And instead of the scissors, like I said, just like paper, I can just fold it and tear it. Because this stuff is very, very fragile. And as it dries out, I don't know if any of you attended my demo years ago when we actually we made boreg, which is similar, only it's an egg and cheese in the Retirement Resource Center. And it was like a hot, dry day there. And I had a sample of the dough out, for people to kind of experiment with. And it very quickly just turned into flakes. that so I said I don't have to worry for my intermediate layers if they are a little worn or torn or wrinkled or anything along those lines, because nobody's really going to see them anyway. And once it starts cooking, it won't matter. And then I try to find a nice, fairly pristine layer for my top layer. And my top layer gets painted. Now, if I wanted, I could like sprinkle sesame seeds or something on this, just kind of for the look. But next I'm going to tell you about, and I'm going to take my extra dough here, and I am going to like immediately fold it back up and roll it back up so I can save it.
How long would that keep, Sue? Or how long?
Like I said, in the refrigerator, I'm going to take it, put it back in its original little plastic bag. It came in the box, and put the box in my fridge, and it'll hold in the fridge for, I would say, about 2 weeks. I have like at times, one time I had a box in my fridge and I kind of forgot all about it. And eventually it will get like moldy. But no, you got a couple weeks, because it's really just flour, water, and preservative. But it's got to be sealed up well. So I'm going to seal it back up tight. Okay, so I got my pan. Like I said, I can sprinkle it with sesame seeds. I don't usually do that, but to decorate it. But then this becomes the critical element, because for years, nobody ever told me this part. And I always wondered where, you go somewhere, and particularly like if they've made it this way in a pan, which is kind of easier than making individual ones. But and like particularly like baklava, and they're like perfect, the walls are like perfectly straight, and the tops all layer in like wonderful little crowns. And anytime I would make it, once this bakes, these are like giant fragile flakes, the whole layer. And so when I take a knife and start to cut into it, it would just like flake into all these pieces. Okay, so I'm using an X-Acto knife, or you could use a single edge razor blade, but most people, their kitchen knives are not going to be thin and sharp enough, because what I want to do is to score through the top layers, so that when I come around to after baking it, I can cut through, and those will still be nice, beautiful pieces, and they won't have all these little layers of dough that just kind of flake off everywhere, because it's going to be like really crispy and flaky. And I don't have, let's see, I'm seeing if I forgot to bring my ruler over. So I'm going to use the edge of the box as a straight edge, and I'll make just cuts just through the top surface.
Someone asked if you can either turn the camera or show it a little bit closer so we can see better. Maybe after you're done, would work fine too.
Okay, I don't know. Can you see me where I am now? because really I'm just taking my knife and I'm not, I don't want to cut through the bottom of the pan. I really just want to cut through my
Yeah,
top.
it's fine now. Thank you.
Okay. And I usually just do squares. If you want to be more elaborate, you could try to do diamonds. But even with my incredibly sharp little knife here, it still wants to pull on those layers and pull them out of place. And so probably what will happen is that some of my layers are going to come loose after this bakes, but they'll still be a whole layer for the piece that I can just put it back on.
Great. A question from Jean Linder. Are you cutting through all of the layers or just the topmost layer?
I'm just going through the topmost layers. I don't want to go through the bottom at all. I want the bottom to be solid, anything like below my greens. And if I cut into the layers that where the greens are, that's fine. Sometimes as it cooks, a little of the liquid will sort of bubble up and stain the surface a little on the top. So I really want to just get maybe like the top 4 layers or so. But it's not critical. It's just like I said, the difference is that the top 3 or 4 layers will almost like flake right off if you go to cut it if you didn't score it. And then, hey, this just goes in the oven, or turns out this pan is small enough to fit in my toaster oven. So it bakes at like 375. I want to say 45 minutes to an hour, kind of until it's the right color. So it should be, nice and golden and crispy. And that's it. Another way of making this, and I'm going to demonstrate with a piece of paper rather than the dough, is that I would put my greens on, fold it over, and then start folding triangles. And I can make little individual ones. Okay. I don't usually do that because it's easier to make it with the layers in a pan. And I'm not a professional caterer, so I can be a little more family style. The finished product at this point, or after it's been baked, it can be frozen. I'll often make 2 pans, bake one, freeze one, and then cook the other one later. I do. I usually do not thaw it before I bake it and just give it extra time, or maybe I get it like partially thawed, but I'm not going to like thaw it for, it doesn't need to be thoroughly thawed before it's baked if I froze it. And that's spring greens pie. I have all this dough left over, which, like I said, I have read that you can refreeze it. To give you an idea, I only used about 1/3 of the package to make this. I can make strudels. I take my sheet, filling it with, chopped fruit, jams, nuts, dried fruit, rolling up just like a sheet is rolled. Just take maybe a couple sheets, layer some butter between them, put down your fruit, roll the whole thing up, give it a couple slices on top so the steam could escape, put it on a baking sheet, and make strudels out of it. Or if you want to make baklava, that's a whole different story, but it's kind of a similar story, only that involves like putting a syrup on when you're done. So any other questions, guys?
Sue, where has been the best, maybe you answered this previously, but the best spring green pie that you've had in the past?
You know, there used to be a Greek restaurant on Midway, which has been gone a long time. It's probably been gone 10 or 15 years. And theirs was really good. Okay. Um, where I could count people down is if if it's soggy, if it's got like too much cheese relative to the greens, because this is intended to be something for greens. Um, but like I said, unfortunately, that one's gone. I thought it was interesting that twice on different coasts, once in North Carolina and once here in San Diego, just like I said, within the last year, I've had a spanakopita, which is, similar, just it's only spinach and the cheese and the egg. And both of theirs suffered from like the sogginess and, in my opinion, too much cheese and not enough greens. But no, it's like I said, it's something that I really kind of got into making because I had like greens which I didn't want to just put in my compost pile, but I needed something to disguise the taste for me.
Yeah, I'm sure it would taste great. Maybe I'll make it one of these days if I have greens in my garden as well. Are there any questions from any other audience members? You're all muted, but you can unmute yourself or put it in the chat.
I don't have a question. I just want to say it looks fabulous. I can't wait to try it.
Okay, yeah. And like I said, if typically I would make two at the same time, because by the time I've gone through the effort to assemble and whatever, and I don't know if you got the feel, but this has a generous portion of greens in it. And some people comment like this was, one of the ways they could like get their kids to eat greens, who wouldn't eat greens otherwise. It's actually pretty healthy, and the vegan version is exceedingly healthy because you've really just got greens, a little flour, and some olive oil. You can also, like, if you look at the recipe, I think I just mentioned pudding. I don't usually put in extra salt because the feta is salty. But you can, it just really calls for salt and pepper. But if you want to jazz it up a little and give it a little red pepper flakes or something, you can also do that. Or
That
whatever
sounds good.
you happen to like.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Sue, I unfortunately joined a little late. Is there a preferred green that you have? I noticed the recipe, offered a variety.
Yeah, and so I'll just kind of to retell that one. I am a CSA member of Be Wise Ranch. And so every winter and spring, I typically get a lot of greens, and a lot of greens that I normally would never have purchased. Okay. If I had a preference, I would use chard. Okay. Maybe some kale. And then, as I mentioned, I always just kind of to mellow it out a little bit. I do use one package of like frozen leaf spinach, and I defrost it and absolutely thoroughly drain it. I put it in a colander, and I either take a ladle or my hands, and I squish out every bit of water out of that frozen one that I could get. I got into doing mustard greens because otherwise I wouldn't eat mustard greens. Okay. I just couldn't find anything that could disguise that flavor well enough where I would go like, hey, yeah, this is good. No, it's like, man, I'm really struggling. If you like bitter, I wouldn't do this. But if, people who like dandelion greens, I wouldn't make the whole pie out of them. But if you happen to like those bitter dandelion greens, you can incorporate some of those even. It literally is, I go to the drawer, my produce drawer in my fridge. And I go like, what have I got now? It's overwhelming.
A question from Nancy. I don't know if you saw that. Thank you, first of all. And do you make pastille? Great to make with the extra sheets of dough.
No, I've never made that, but because you can make all kinds of great things with the dough. And I would recommend the strudels or strudel-like things are really like easy and quick. You can even cheat and use, canned pie filling or something like that. Although that's I have to admit, a little too sweet or sugary for me. So sometimes what I do is I'll put like, chopped up apple and a little like raspberry jam and in the strudels and make that. It's something that you can just, if you like raisins, put raisins in. If you like dried cranberries, put dried cranberries in.
That sounds great. So yeah, Marcy, what time should we all come over for dinner?
Dinner. Okay. Right.
Sue, I wanted to make a comment if I can. It's Donna.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for doing this. It looks really good. I've never seen it on a menu, and I love Greek food. I've gone to a lot of Greek restaurants. So I will look for it, but I will definitely make it. And about the strudel, my sister used to make them every year for Christmas, and that was what we had for Christmas breakfast. And she would make an apple one, a cherry one, and a blueberry one, and they were pie filling. But she buttered each of those layers and then rolled them all up, and they were, really delicious.
Oh yeah, no, it is. It's really delicious. Okay.
Yeah.
Like I said,
you can put anything in them.
You could put anything. I mean, you could think of, there's the world of savories and the worlds of sweet pies.
Right.
And these really are like pies. And I have to admit, I never got into making traditional pie dough. Okay. I'd much rather make a pie using the phyllo dough. It's just my particular preference. I never mastered traditional pie dough. One of my sisters and my brother did, but not me.
Yeah, so Debbie says that maybe chocolate chip raspberry strudel might be one.
Yeah. Oh, that sounds great. Yeah.
And then a question from Jean Linder.
Actually, a comment on leftover phyllo dough. I once made something where I cut strips after buttering them. And I don't know if you've ever folded a flag where you have to fold one corner over and then you get this triangular shaped thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
that's what I'm trying to like demonstrate with this piece of
right.
paper.
Anyway, I just did little tiny ones that ended up like with an inch on each side filled with like chopped up nuts stuck together with honey, and put that in these little tiny packets. And you didn't have to butter all the individual layers because you folded it over so many times that you got the layers just from buttering the one strip.
Right.
And my guests love those.
Yeah, just like same thing. We've most of us have seen baklava, or actually in Turkish or Armenian, it's baklava. It's with more like a P instead of a B, but where you do your layers and you're coming in. But there's also something called burma, and burma, you make a strip and you're going to butter it, and you're going to sprinkle a thin layer of like chopped up nuts, and then you roll it all up, and you're making your strip actually wider, and then you kind of crunch it a little as you put it in the pan for when it's going to bake. And that's why if you see it in like a Mideast bakery, it has a little kind of crunchy surface. Okay, a little, and that's how they achieve that, by rolling it and then kind of squishing it together a little bit and then putting it while it's raw, and then when it bakes up. And that's quote unquote considered easier than making baklava. Same thing though, when it comes out, it gets coated with either a sugar or honey sugar syrup. But yeah, the dough is really pretty versatile. you can make, I've been in restaurants which make appetizers by taking more like a square of the dough, putting whatever kind of could truly be any type of filling, and then gathering it up like a little purse so that it's like a little pouch. And like I said, the dough is pretty versatile. You can do all kinds of things, particularly on making individual little appetizers or pastries.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you once again, Sue. I think we're all very glad that these food demos take place right before lunch, because I will be grabbing lunch quite earnestly right after this. So thank you so much for hosting this particular food demo. Does anyone have any additional questions, comments?
Yeah, when are we going to be able to get back and actually, eat these?
I will be working on something, so hopefully in the near future, but I can't make promises. But yes, thank you all so much for attending, and we look forward to the next one. Thank you.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thanks, Sue. That was great.
Bye.